Captain Zephyr Ignatius was having one of those days where the universe seemed to be conspiring against him. To be fair, in his line of work, the universe usually was. He stood on the bridge of the Rust Bucket, a ship that, contrary to its name, was more of a finely tuned killing machine than a pile of scrap metal, at least on good days. Today was not one of those days. "Captain, we've got a problem," said his first mate, a wiry woman named Kaltora with a penchant for understatement. "I swear if it's another damn issue with the hyperdrive, I'm going to personally throw the engineer out the airlock," Zephyr replied, not even looking up from the console. He tapped a series of buttons, trying to get the radar to stop displaying an impromptu light show. Kaltora smirked. "Nope, just the Xylar Dominion fleet closing in faster than a nanosecond divorce," Zephyr groaned. "Oh, just that. Here I was worried. How much time we got?" "Enough time to write our wills, but not enough to actually die of boredom doing it," Kaltora said, trying to sound optimistic. "That's the spirit," Zephyr replied. He finally managed to stabilize the radar, and the screen showed an impressive array of red blips converging on their little green dot. "All right, let's gather the crew for a team-building exercise in survival." As they entered the mess hall, the crew was already gathered around, sporting expressions that ranged from mildly concerned to existentially terrified. It was a small crew, but they'd been through a lot together. A ragtag bunch of misfits and outcasts, each as indispensable as a spare sock in a washing machine. "All right, folks," Zephyr started, clapping his hands together. "We've got ourselves a situation. The Xylar Dominion, in case you haven't noticed, is coming for a visit, and they don't do tea and cookies." "I hear they're into teabagging galaxies, though," piped up Jax, the ship's engineer, who looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts in a junkyard. "Charming as always, Jax," Zephyr said dryly. "So, here's the plan. We hold them off long enough for the rest of the human fleet to regroup. Maybe even take a few of them with us. That's if our guns don't malfunction," grumbled Sierra, the weapons specialist, whose relationship with the ship's armament was somewhere between love and homicidal rage. Zephyr nodded. "I've got faith in you, Sierra. And if not, well, better to go out in a blaze of glory than a slow death by bureaucracy." The crew chuckled, a nervous sound that bounced off the walls like an echo of impending doom. "All right, you know your roles," Zephyr said. "Let's make this day one for the history books, or at least a cautionary tale." As the crew dispersed to their stations, Zephyr took a moment to gaze out the viewport. The stars were indifferent, as usual, twinkling in the vast expanse of space. Somewhere out there, humanity's future was being calculated by alien algorithms and the whims of cosmic dice. "What do you think, Kaltora? Think we can hold him off?" Kaltora shrugged, a half-smile on her lips. "I've got more faith in this crew than the politicians back home, that's for sure." "High praise," Zephyr said. "Let's hope the universe is feeling charitable today." Back on the bridge, Zephyr slipped into the captain's chair, a relic from a time when ships were built with actual comfort in mind. As the crew settled into their stations, the tension in the air was as thick as a bureaucrat's skull. "Incoming hail from the Xylar flagship," said Kaltora, glancing at her console. "Want to answer it, or shall we pretend we're not home?" "Might as well see what they want," Zephyr sighed. "Open a channel." The screen flickered to life, revealing a Xylar commander who looked like he was bred in a vat of bad intentions and tentacles. "Captain Ignatius," the alien said, his voice a guttural rumble, "you stand in defiance of the Xylar Dominion. Surrender and you shall be spared." Zephyr tilted his head, pretending to consider the offer. "Spared what exactly? The pleasure of your company." The Xylar's eyes narrowed, an impressive feat given their lack of eyelids. "Surrender or be obliterated." "Tempting," Zephyr said, tapping his chin, "but I think we'll pass. We've grown a bit attached to this whole not being subjugated thing." Kaltora snorted quietly, and Zephyr couldn't help but grin. "So, if you don't mind, we'll just hold on to our freedom a little longer." The commander scowled, or did what passed for it among his kind. "Then prepare for annihilation." "Looking forward to it," Zephyr replied cheerfully and cut the transmission. Well, that was fun, charming fellow, Kaltora remarked. Almost makes you miss the space pirates, Zephyr chuckled. Almost. All right, let's get ready for incoming unpleasantness. The rust bucket hummed with energy as the crew prepared for battle. Shields were raised, weapons primed, and the tension in the air reached a crescendo. Engage defensive maneuvers, Zephyr ordered, settling into his seat like a king on a very uncomfortable throne. As the Xylar fleet drew closer, the first shots were fired. Beams of destructive light sliced through the void, a deadly ballet of energy and destruction. The rust bucket rocked under the impact, but held firm, like a stubborn old mule refusing to budge. Shields at 70%, reported Kaltora, her fingers dancing over the controls. Keep him steady, Zephyr replied, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. Sierra unleashed a barrage of retaliatory fire, the ship's cannons belching fury into the void. "Take that, you ugly bastards," she muttered, her eyes alight with battle fervor. "Remind me to never get on your bad side," Jax quipped from his station, tweaking the power distribution like a maestro with a very unstable orchestra. "Just keep us flying, Jax," Zephyr said, his focus unwavering. The battle raged on, a symphony of chaos and destruction. The rust bucket bobbed and weaved, a dancer in a deadly waltz with fate. Zephyr's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins like liquid fire. "Incoming torpedoes port side," shouted Kaltora, her voice cutting through the din like a knife. "Evasive maneuvers," Zephyr barked, gripping the armrests of his chair as the ship lurched violently to the side. The torpedoes streaked past, narrowly missing their mark. The rust bucket shuddered but held together, a testament to its crew's determination, or sheer bloody-mindedness. "Nice flying," Zephyr said, giving Kaltora an approving nod. "Thanks, Captain," she replied breathlessly. "Just doing my job." As the battle dragged on, the odds seemed insurmountable, but Zephyr's crew fought with the tenacity of cornered beasts. They might have been outnumbered, but they were far from defeated. "Shields at 30%, Kaltora called out, her voice tinged with urgency. Zephyr's mind raced, calculating their options with the precision of a gambler on a losing streak. "All right, let's try something risky. Jax, reroute power from life support to the weapons." Jax's eyebrows shot up. "You sure about that, Captain?" Zephyr grinned, a feral expression. "We're not here to live forever, Jax. Just long enough to make them regret picking a fight with us." Jax nodded, fingers flying over the controls. The rust bucket's cannon surged with renewed energy, unleashing a withering volley at the encroaching Xylar ships. "Direct hit," shouted Sierra triumphantly as one of the enemy vessels exploded in a dazzling display of pyrotechnics. A cheer went up from the crew, a ragged but defiant sound that echoed through the ship. The battle raged on, each moment an eternity of chaos and violence. The rust bucket took hit after punishing hit, but still it fought on, a testament to the indomitable spirit of its crew. And then, just as hope seemed a fleeting memory, the Xylar fleet began to pull back, their ships retreating from the battered human stronghold. "They're withdrawing," Kaltora said, disbelief coloring her voice. Zephyr sagged in his chair, exhaustion washing over him. "Guess we convinced them we're not worth the trouble." The crew erupted into cheers, a cacophony of relief and triumph that filled the bridge. "All right, everybody," Zephyr said, raising a hand to quiet them. "Let's not get too comfortable. They might just be regrouping for a second round." Kaltora nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Or maybe they've realized we're the wrong humans to mess with." "One can hope," Zephyr replied wryly. "In the meantime, let's patch up what we can and prep for whatever they throw at us next." As the crew set to work, Zephyr leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a moment of respite. The rust bucket had survived another day, and so had they. But hanging over them all was the specter of the Xylar Dominion, a relentless force that wouldn't stop until the galaxy was theirs. Zephyr knew the fight was far from over, but for now, they'd earned a brief respite, a moment to catch their breath before plunging back into the fray. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, and that the real battle was still to come. "Here's to us," he murmured, raising an imaginary glass in a silent toast to his crew's tenacity and their refusal to lie down in the face of overwhelming odds. As the stars continued their indifferent dance across the heavens, the rust bucket prepared for its next stand, defiant and unyielding against the tide of destiny. The rust bucket's bridge, still reeking of sweat, burnt circuits, and something that might have been victory, was quieter now, but only because everyone was busy pretending they had more than a snowball's chance in a supernova of surviving the next encounter. Zephyr, sitting in his trusty chair, felt like a toddler in an amusement park ride, barely strapped in, and unsure if the next loop would be his last. "All right, folks," he announced, injecting false confidence into his tone. The Xyler could be regrouping or just reconsidering their life choices. "Either way, we've got a breather. Let's make sure we don't waste it." Jax, eyes flicking between a half-dozen screens, muttered, "Think I'll take up knitting. Seems less stressful than holding this tub together." Kaltora, always the optimist with a side of realism, looked over. "I've got some yarn somewhere. Could knit us a new hyperdrive or a noose," Sierra added, her fingers still twitching from the adrenaline. "Depending on how this goes." Zephyr chuckled, but it was the kind of laugh that tasted more like desperation than humor. "I'll take whatever we can get. Meanwhile, what's the status on our guests?" "Still playing hard to get." Kaltora tapped her console, a frown creasing her brow. "We've got movement on the radar. Looks like a new formation. Could be a different tactic, a new tactic from the Xyler. They must have hired a consultant," Zephyr quipped. "Keep an eye on it. Last thing we need is a surprise party." The crew busied themselves, each member a cog in the rust bucket's barely functioning machine. They were held together by duct tape, faith, and a good dose of insanity. Zephyr had always suspected the last one was the most important. "Captain," Jax called, his voice tinged with something that might have been caution. "You're gonna want to see this." Zephyr stood, feeling every one of his years in space in his bones, and ambled over to Jax's station. "What have you got?" Jax pointed at the screen, his finger hovering over a cluster of unfamiliar symbols. "Picked up some anomalous readings. Looks like they're not just moving. They're folding space, folding space." Zephyr crossed his arms, staring at the display as if it owed him money. "What are they doing making origami out there?" "They're trying to outflank us," Kaltora added, joining them. Her expression was grim, the kind that usually preceded an unfortunate revelation. "If they can get behind our lines, then we're toast," Zephyr finished for her. "Perfect, just perfect. Anyone got a plan to counter a three-dimensional pincer move?" Sierra snorted. "You make it sound like I'm missing a board piece from my tactical game." Zephyr sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "All right, let's think this through. If they're using some kind of fancy space folding trick, can we disrupt it?" Jax leaned back, scratching at the stubble on his chin. "Maybe. If we could generate a counterfield, something to throw their calculations off." Zephyr nodded, feeling a spark of hope. "Good. Get on it. But remember, we're not looking to win. Just survive long enough to make them sick of looking at us, more than they already are." Sierra asked, a grin tugging at her lips. Zephyr grinned back, a wolfish smile that felt like a battle cry. "Exactly." As the crew sprang into action, the bridge buzzed with a sense of purpose that was almost infectious. Almost. Zephyr knew better than to let hope run rampant. Hope was a dangerous thing, attracting disaster like a magnet, and he'd already danced with doom more times than he cared to count. "Captain, you might want to see this too," Kaltora called, her voice calm but urgent. Zephyr wandered over, peering at her screen. The readout was a mess of numbers and symbols, but the gist was clear enough. "Now what?" "Looks like they're pulling energy from somewhere else," Kaltora said, frowning. "Power spikes are off the charts somewhere else." Zephyr echoed, feeling an all-too-familiar sense of dread. "You mean another universe?" "Seems so," Kaltora nodded. "Parallel universe warfare. They're trying to use alternate dimensions to boost their capabilities." "Great. Just what we needed," Zephyr muttered. As if one universe wasn't enough trouble, the thought of fighting enemies who could hop between realities like tourists with a multiverse travel pass was daunting, to say the least. And if the Xyler could pull energy from another universe, what else could they do? Zephyr scratched his head, trying to wring out a solution from his overtaxed brain. All right, folks, change of plan. We're not just fighting them here. We've got to disrupt whatever they're doing over there too. Jax was already tapping furiously at his console. We might be able to overcharge the hyperdrive, create a burst that'll scramble their signals. Sounds risky, Kaltora noted, her eyes narrowing. We could end up stranded in the middle of nowhere, or worse. We're already hip-deep in worse, Zephyr pointed out. Besides, if we don't try, there isn't going to be anywhere to strand ourselves anyway. Kaltora nodded, conceding the point. All right, let's get to it. As the crew raced to implement the new plan, the tension on the bridge was almost palpable. Zephyr could almost see the weight of every decision pressing down on him, a monstrous burden that threatened to crush him under its merciless logic. Captain Jax called, his voice strained but determined. Hyperdrive's ready. Just say the word. Zephyr took a deep breath, the kind that tasted like desperation and smelled like burnt circuits. Do it. Jax hit the switch and the rust bucket shuddered, a groan of protest rippling through its battered hull as the hyperdrive surged with power it was never meant to handle. A pulse of energy rippled through space, an invisible shockwave that reached out to touch the invisible threads binding the Xyler's plan together. For a moment, nothing happened, and then the radar lit up with confusion, a cacophony of signals that painted a picture of chaos among the Xyler fleet. Their neat formation dissolved into disarray, ships scattering like startled birds. Looks like it worked, Kaltora said, a note of disbelief in her voice. Zephyr allowed himself a small, satisfied grin. Maybe, but let's not start celebrating just yet. They're still out there and they're still pissed. Let's keep moving then, Sierra suggested, her fingers twitching with readiness. Hit them again before they regroup. Zephyr nodded, feeling the weight of each decision like a chain around his neck. All right. Let's see if we can make them regret this particular trip across the multiverse. As the rust bucket plunged back into battle, Zephyr's mind raced, calculating and recalculating the odds. They were in uncharted territory now, facing an enemy that could jump between realities and wield energies beyond their comprehension. But they were still human, still fighting with the stubborn resilience that had carried them this far. And Zephyr knew that even if they were outmatched and outgunned, they wouldn't go down without a fight. Here's to not dying today, he murmured, feeling the familiar rush of battle sweep over him like a wave, and making sure they won't forget us anytime soon. The rust bucket surged forward, weapons blazing and shields flaring as it charged into the fray. Zephyr clung to the chaos, the thrill of combat and the grim satisfaction of knowing that, win or lose, they'd make the Xyler remember why humanity wasn't an easy target. Status report, he barked as the ship rocked under the impact of enemy fire. Shields at 40%, Kaltora shouted, her voice barely audible over the clamor. But they're holding. Well, that's one good thing, Zephyr muttered, fingers gripping the armrest of his chair as if he could squeeze luck out of it. On the view screen, the Xyler ships were a chaotic dance of fire and light, their sleek forms weaving through the void with a grace that belied their destructive intent. Zephyr watched as Sierra unleashed another volley, the rust bucket's cannon snarling with fury. Direct hit on one of their cruisers, Sierra announced, her voice a mixture of triumph and disbelief. Let's see them bounce back from that. Zephyr allowed himself a wry grin. Keep it up, Sierra. Make them regret recruiting those consultants. Jax, still focused on his console, called over, hyperdrive's cooling down. We might have fried something, but I think we can jump again if we need to. Good to know we've got options, Zephyr replied, even if they're terrible ones. The battle raged on, each second stretching into eternity. Zephyr could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, a relentless tide that threatened to drag him under. And yet beneath the fear there was something else, a fierce determination, a refusal to let go, to give up. Captain, we're picking up something new, Kaltora said suddenly, her voice cutting through the din like a knife. Zephyr glanced over, his heart sinking as he saw the new blip on the radar. "What now?" "Looks like a new ship," Kaltora replied grimly. "Something bigger." Zephyr's stare fixed on the screen, eyes narrowing as he took in the new threat. The ship was massive, a monstrous silhouette that dwarfed everything else around it. It moved with a predatory grace, and Zephyr had the sinking feeling that it was here to finish what the rest of the Xylar fleet had started. "Great," he muttered. "Just what we needed." A boss fight. Sierra's gaze was fixed on the view screen, her expression a mix of awe and defiance. "Think we can take it?" Zephyr didn't have an answer, but he knew that they didn't have a choice either. They'd come this far, and they weren't about to turn tail and run, not when the stakes were so high. "We're not backing down," he said, his voice firm. "We've got to keep fighting. We've got to show them that we're not just going to roll over and die." "But Captain," Jax interjected, his tone cautious, "what if they can tap into that parallel universe for reinforcements?" Zephyr considered the implications, his mind racing through possibilities. The idea of an endless tide of enemies pouring out of a rift in space was enough to send a shiver down his spine, but he forced it away. "We'll cross that bridge when we get there," he said finally. "Right now, let's focus on what's in front of us, keep the pressure on and make every shot count." With that, the rust bucket charged forward once more, a battered but unbroken warrior facing down an armada. Zephyr's hands gripped the armrests as the ship shuddered beneath him, the chaos of battle washing over them like a storm. "Here's to us," he murmured again, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. "And here's to making them pay for every inch." As the rust bucket surged into the fray, Zephyr felt the familiar thrill of battle rise within him, a fire that burned bright and fierce, defying the darkness that threatened to engulf them all. Zephyr rubbed his temples, contemplating the universe's infinite ways to mess with him. The Xylar Dominion was breathing down their necks, and now he had the brilliant idea of turning a bunch of civilian freighters into makeshift warships. It was either going to be utterly genius or a complete disaster. Knowing his luck, it leaned toward the latter. "All right, gang," Zephyr said, motioning the crew to huddle up around the rust bucket's flickering holo table, which displayed a crude map of their tactical engagement. "We've got these civilian freighters hanging around like spare parts at a junkyard. Time we gave them a bit of a makeover." Kaltora's eyebrows shot up, her optimism battling valiantly against realism. "You mean we're going to arm these things? With what harsh language?" Zephyr smirked, appreciating the spunk. "Exactly. Along with some repurposed mining lasers, a few well-placed explosives, and whatever else we can scrape together. It's not pretty, but pretty doesn't win battles. Ugly might." Sierra chipped in, her dark humor a constant companion. "So, we're taking flying trash to a whole new level. I like it. Maybe we can call it Operation Bothersome Flies." Zephyr winked, the kind of smile that spoke of equal parts desperation and determination. "More like Operation Make Them Regret Underestimating Humans." Jax, fiddling with his console, looked up with a sarcastic grin. "And here I thought we were just going to bore them to death with our charm." "Death by charm is a slow burn," Zephyr replied. "We need something with a bit more bang." The plan was simple, if only in concept. They take the civilian freighters, slap on mining gear, some of those cute little astromech drones that like to tinker, and voila, instant warships, or something resembling them. The Xylar weren't expecting an army of cobbled-together tin cans, which meant they might just catch them off guard. Kaltora glanced over the holomap with a frown. "Even if we pull this off without turning those freighters into space debris, won't the Dominion just send more ships to squash us flat?" Zephyr nodded, conceding the point. "They might, but we'll have shown them what humans can do when we're backed into a corner, that we're not just sitting ducks." Jack stretched, yawning. "Yeah, we're the ducks with laser beams strapped on. That'll keep them on their toes." Sierra chuckled, leaning back against the wall. "We might even make it into the next Xylar history books as a cautionary tale. Never corner a bunch of desperate humans." Zephyr felt a touch of pride as he watched his crew banter. They might be outnumbered, outgunned, and out of their minds, but they weren't out of spirit. If the Xylar thought they could just waltz in and have their way, they were in for a rude awakening. "All right," he clapped his hands, bringing the meeting to a close. "Let's get to it. We've got a bunch of freighters to convince they are battleships." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. The Rustbucket's hangar bay buzzed with a frantic energy as the crew tore into their new project with all the enthusiasm of a kid ripping open presents. Zephyr supervised the controlled chaos, making sure no one got too carried away and accidentally blew themselves up. "Careful with that," he hollered as Jax attempted to attach a laser cannon to the side of a freighter. "We're trying to make warships, not fireworks." Jax rolled his eyes, pulling a face. "Relax, Captain. I'm not that bad. Besides, if this thing blows, we might just take a few Xylar with us." "Not the optimistic outcome I had in mind," Zephyr shot back, but there was a twinkle of amusement in his eye. "Try not to turn him into confetti before the party starts." Kaltora, perched on a crate and tinkering with a jumble of wires, looked over. "Think these will actually work, or are we just setting ourselves up for a spectacular failure?" Zephyr shrugged, the picture of nonchalance. "Who knows? But if we go down, I'd rather it be with a bang than a whimper." Sierra, sitting cross-legged on the floor and assembling a makeshift bomb, snorted. "Yeah, let's give them something to write home about." "Dear Mom," humans exploded magnificently. As the hours ticked by, the freighters began to take shape, transforming from ragtag cargo haulers into something resembling a poor man's armada. It was a testament to human ingenuity, or insanity, that they managed to pull it off. By the time they'd finished, even Zephyr had to admit they looked somewhat formidable. The freighters bore a patchwork of armor plating, bristling with mining lasers and jury-rigged cannons. If they didn't scare the Xylar, they'd at least confuse them. "Not bad," Zephyr remarked, surveying their handiwork with a critical eye. "Not bad at all." Kaltora wiped a smudge of grease from her cheek, looking pleased. "Let's just hope they hold together when it counts." Zephyr nodded, feeling a flicker of hope despite himself. One way to find out. With the freighters ready, they set their plan into motion. The Rustbucket led the charge, a ragtag fleet of repurposed ships trailing in its wake. Zephyr watched the viewscreen, heart pounding as they approached the Xylar fleet. "Get ready," he said, voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "We're about to show them what we're made of." As they closed in, the Xylar ships turned to meet them, sleek and menacing as ever. But this time, the Rustbucket wasn't alone. The freighters spread out behind it like a swarm of angry bees, buzzing with a threat all their own. "Let's give them something to remember," Zephyr said, his voice a low growl of defiance. Sierra was already at her station, fingers flying over the controls. "Let's see how they like a taste of human creativity." The Rustbucket opened fire, cannons roaring to life in a blazing salvo. The freighters followed suit, their makeshift weapons adding to the chaos. It was an orchestra of destruction, a symphony of violence orchestrated by desperation. Zephyr watched as the Xylar ships scrambled to respond, caught off guard by the unexpected assault. Their neat formation dissolved into chaos, ships darting in every direction as they tried to regroup. "Looks like we've got their attention," Jax noted, his tone equal parts satisfied and apprehensive. Zephyr allowed himself a fleeting grin. "Good, let's keep it that way." The battle raged on, a dizzying maelstrom of fire and fury. The Rustbucket wove through the chaos with a grace that belied its battered appearance, leading the freighters in a relentless onslaught. Kaltora's voice crackled over the comms, a note of urgency in her words. "Captain, they are regrouping. We can't let them get organized again." Zephyr cursed under his breath. The Xylar were quick learners and they wouldn't fall for the same trick twice. "Keep the pressure on," he ordered. "We've got to keep them off balance," Sierra, ever the pragmatist, added, "and if that doesn't work we can always try Plan B." "Plan B?" Zephyr asked, eyebrow raised. "Yeah," Sierra replied with a smirk. "Run like hell." Despite the odds stacked against them, the crew fought on, determined to make the Xylar pay for every inch. Zephyr could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on him, but he refused to let it break him. For every freighter that fell, there were two more ready to take its place. The Xyler might have had the advantage in firepower, but the humans had something else entirely: grit, determination, and a healthy disregard for authority. As the battle wore on, Zephyr found himself caught up in the thrill of it all. The danger, the chaos, the sheer audacity of their plan, it was all-consuming, a fire that burned away everything else. And even as the Xyler closed in, their ships forming a deadly net around the Rust Bucket and its fleet, Zephyr knew they'd made an impact. They'd shown the Dominion what it meant to face humanity in all its unpredictable glory. "Looks like they're pulling back," Jax said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Zephyr exhaled, a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "For now. But we can't let our guard down," Kaltora, still monitoring her screen, nodded. "They'll be back, and probably with reinforcements." Zephyr felt the familiar weight settle on his shoulders, but there was a new resolve in him too. They'd bought themselves time and they'd made their mark. The Xyler wouldn't forget this encounter anytime soon. "All right," he said, voice firm. "Let's regroup, repair what we can, and get ready for the next round. We're not done yet." As the Rust Bucket and its ragtag fleet limped away from the battlefield, Zephyr couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. They'd faced down the Xyler and lived to tell the tale. For now, that was enough. "Here's to not dying today," he murmured once more, a wry smile playing on his lips. "And to making sure they remember why humans are a force to be reckoned with." The battle might have been over, but the war was far from finished. And Zephyr, for all his cynicism, was ready to see it through to the bitter end. The Rust Bucket floated in the vast emptiness of space, a rusty tin can among a sea of stars. Inside, the atmosphere was anything but serene. The crew gathered on the bridge, eyes glued to the holo-table like gamblers at the galaxy's unluckiest casino. The Xyler Dominion fleet had retreated, but not for long, like a cat playing with its prey. Zephyr Ignatius, the captain trying to hold it all together, leaned over the holo-table, hoping it would offer some last-minute miracle. It didn't. "Well, crew, looks like we've poked the bear and now it's coming back with bigger claws." Jax, never one to avoid stating the obvious with a twist of sarcasm, chimed in. "At least we can say we're memorable, right? Remember when those human lunatics turned freighters into warships? Good times." Kaltora sighed, her optimism wearing thin. "I think it's more like, remember how they tried to fight with duct tape and dreams, Sierra, always with the gallows humor added and lost. Don't forget the losing part." Zephyr waved a dismissive hand. "Details. Our job is to make their victory as Pyrrhic as possible." Before anyone could respond, the ship's radar flickered ominously, like a ghost with bad intentions. Red dots began to bloom across the screen, faster than you could say, "We're screwed." The Dominion fleet was back, and this time they brought the whole toy box from Parallel Universe Tech World. "Well, isn't that a gut punch?" Zephyr muttered, rubbing the back of his neck as the tension ratcheted up a notch. Their makeshift armada might have been impressive in a scrapyard kind of way, but against what was lining up on the radar, they weren't much more than a colorful display of future debris. Jax leaned back in his chair, hands behind his head. "Looks like they've upgraded. How thoughtful of them." "Yeah, great to see the Dominions into recycling," Kaltora said, her tone caught between admiration and exasperation. "We throw junk at them and they throw shiny death back." Zephyr's eyes narrowed, trying to spot a silver lining in the storm cloud. "Any chance this is all just an elaborate bluff?" Sierra snorted. "If it is, they should get into acting. That's one hell of a show." The atmosphere on the bridge was tense, the kind of tension that only gallows humor could puncture. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of snacks, a trifecta of doom. "All right, folks," Zephyr said, clapping his hands to gather attention. "Let's not lose our heads just yet. We knew this day would come. Well, not exactly this day, but a day." Kaltora gave him a sidelong glance. "Ever the optimist, Captain," Zephyr shrugged. "Gotta keep the morale up somehow. It was then that Leora Thane, their key ally and resident skeptic, piped up from the corner. She'd been quietly observing, the kind of quiet that usually preceded a barrage of criticism. "Zephyr, can we talk or lecture?" he asked, not entirely joking. "Call it a concerned discussion," Leora replied, arms crossed. Zephyr sighed, motioning her to the side of the bridge. The rest of the crew busied themselves, pretending not to eavesdrop but failing spectacularly. "Look," Leora started, her voice low but firm, "I get it. You're trying to do the impossible here, but this isn't just a ragtag operation anymore. We've got people relying on us." Zephyr raised an eyebrow. "And you think I'm playing this fast and loose? I think," Leora said carefully, "that you might be getting caught up in your own legend. We need to think about the lives at stake." "It's not just about making a point." Zephyr rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of command settle even heavier. "I know what's at stake, Leora, but what choice do we have? Roll over and let them steamroll us?" "No," she agreed, "but maybe we can find a way to make peace with them. Buy us more time, figure out a strategy that doesn't end in a blaze of glory peace." Zephyr laughed, but there was no humor in it. "With a fleet like that breathing down our necks, we might as well ask them to come over for tea." Leora's eyes were hard, unyielding. "We've got to try something, Zephyr, because right now we're headed for a fight we can't win." Zephyr opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, an alarm blared. The kind of alarm that said, "Hey, remember those bigger claws? They're here." The crew snapped into action, professionalism masking their fear. Zephyr nodded to Leora, conversation paused but far from over. "We'll finish this later. Right now, let's make sure we survive to have that chat." Back at the helm, Zephyr barked orders like a captain who knew the universe was out to get him, but refused to give it the satisfaction. "Everyone to battle stations. Time to show them what a desperate bunch of humans can do." The Xylar fleet had deployed their new toys, sleek, shimmering ships that looked like they'd been designed by someone with a grudge against physics. The Rustbucket's sensors went haywire trying to keep track of them. Sierra glanced at her console, a mix of awe and annoyance on her face. "They've got cloaking tech." "Of course they do." "Great," Jax muttered. "Now they are invisible." Because facing a visible armada wasn't enough, Zephyr grimaced. The Xylar were playing dirty, and why wouldn't they? They had the tech, the numbers, and the arrogance of a species that thought it had already won. "All right," Zephyr called out. "We focus fire on their lead ships. If we can knock out their command structure, we might stand a chance." "You heard the man," Kaltora said, rallying the crew. "Let's paint their pretty toys with some human ingenuity." The battle unfolded with a brutality that left no room for finesse. The Rustbucket fired volley after volley, its guns straining under the assault. The freighters, little more than armed tin cans, swarmed around the Xylar ships, trying to be as pesky as possible. "Keep it up," Zephyr shouted, forcing determination into his voice. "Don't give them an inch." The bridge was a cacophony of alarms, shouts, and the dull thrum of the ship's system straining to cope. Zephyr felt every hit the Rustbucket took like a personal insult, each impact a reminder of their precarious position. Jax, monitoring communications, suddenly looked up. "Captain, we're getting a hail from the Xylar flagship." "Well, isn't that interesting?" Zephyr said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Put them through." The holo display flickered, filling with the image of a Xylar commander, all smooth scales and disdainful eyes. "Human captain," the commander began, his voice oily with superiority. "Your resistance is amusing but ultimately futile." Zephyr leaned forward, feigning nonchalance. "Futile, sure, but you've got to admit, we throw a hell of a party." The commander's lips curled in a sneer. "Surrender now, and we may grant you mercy." "Mercy?" Zephyr echoed, raising an eyebrow. "That's generous, considering you came to pick a fight." The commander's eyes narrowed. "This is your last chance." Zephyr paused, weighing his options. He glanced around at his crew, their faces set with a determination that mirrored his own. "Here's a counteroffer," he said, meeting the Xylar's gaze. "We keep fighting, you keep underestimating us, and maybe we see who laughs last." The Xylar commander's face twisted into an expression of disdain before the transmission cut off. Zephyr turned back to his crew. "You heard him, folks. Back to it. The battle resumed with renewed intensity. Zephyr could feel the tension thrumming through his veins, a potent mix of fear and resolve. The Xylar ships were relentless, their superior technology pushing the Rust Bucket and its fleet to their breaking point. Kaltora's voice crackled over the comms, urgency prickling her words. "Captain, we've got multiple hull breaches. We can't take much more of this. Patch what you can," Zephyr replied, his jaw set. "We hold the line until we can't." Sierra, manning the weapons, let out a whoop as one of the Xylar ships exploded in a spray of fire and debris. "Take that, you scaly bastards." The victory was short-lived as more Xylar ships closed in, their weapons tearing through the freighters with ruthless efficiency. Jax's voice cut through the chaos, a note of grim determination in his tone. "We're losing too many ships. We need a new plan." Zephyr's mind raced, searching for a way out of the nightmare. His gaze fell on the holo table, the battle map littered with the blinking icons of friend and foe. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "We change tactics. We go for their engines, their power cores. Cripple them." Kaltora responded with a nod, barking orders to the remaining freighters. "Let's give him something to worry about." The Rust Bucket and its fleet shifted their focus, targeting the Xylar ship's vulnerable spots. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation was all they had left. As the battle dragged on, the Rust Bucket shuddered under the onslaught, systems failing one by one. Zephyr knew they were running out of time, out of options. But even as the odds stacked against them, he refused to back down. "Keep firing," he yelled, his voice hoarse but unwavering. "We're not done yet." The crew fought on, fueled by adrenaline and the stubborn refusal to give up. Each hit shook the ship, each explosion a reminder of the thin line between victory and annihilation. Zephyr caught Leora's eye across the bridge, a silent understanding passing between them. They might not have the luxury of making peace, but they weren't alone in this fight. They had each other, a ragtag band of misfits and outcasts, bound by a shared determination to defy the odds. As the Xylar fleet pressed their advantage, Zephyr knew they were out of time. But even in the face of overwhelming odds, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of defiance. They'd given the Xylar a fight to remember, a testament to humanity's resilience and tenacity. "Here's to not going gentle into that good night," he murmured, a wry smile tugging at his lips. The battle might have been nearing its end, but Zephyr and his crew weren't about to bow out quietly. They'd made their stand, and for now, that was enough. The Rust Bucket's bridge was a symphony of chaos, with alarms wailing like a chorus of damned souls on payday. Zephyr Ignatius stood in the eye of the storm, trying to keep his head above water in a sea of despair. It was the kind of day that started with a cup of sludge that had the audacity to call itself coffee, and was now ending with a full-scale assault from the Xylar Dominion, who seemed hell-bent on turning the Rust Bucket into space confetti. "Captain, I'm starting to think they don't like us," Jax said, fingers dancing across his console like a pianist at a funeral. "Not with that attitude they don't," Zephyr shot back, eyes glued to the holo table. The battle map was a mess of icons, each one a tiny reminder of just how screwed they were. To say the situation was bleak would be like saying space is big. The Xylar were throwing everything they had at them, and the Rust Bucket was groaning under the pressure. But Zephyr wasn't about to let a little thing like certain doom get in the way of a good fight. "Kaltora, how's our hull holding up?" Zephyr asked, though he dreaded the answer. "It's like asking how a sieve holds water, Captain," Kaltora replied, her voice dry as a desert. "Fantastic. Keep it together with spit and prayers if you have to." The ship shook violently as another barrage tore into them, lights flickering like they were in some cosmic discotheque. Zephyr gritted his teeth, wondering if the universe had a personal vendetta against him, or if it was just feeling particularly malicious today. "Zephyr," came a voice over the comms, strained but steady. It was his old mentor, Fenton Greaves, speaking from one of the makeshift freighters. The man had the kind of face that could make a grizzly bear think twice, and a voice that could soothe an angry mob or incite a riot depending on his mood. "Fenton, now's not a great time for a catch-up," Zephyr replied, though he was glad to hear the old bastard's voice. "I know, kid, but listen, I've got a plan to buy us some time. It's a bit unorthodox." "Unorthodox? Fenton, my whole life is unorthodox." "Well, this involves me taking one of these freighters and ramming it straight into their flagship." Zephyr's heart skipped a beat. "That's not unorthodox, that's suicidal semantics," Fenton chuckled, a sound that was both comforting and infuriating. "But it'll give you a window. You take it and you get our people out of here." Zephyr opened his mouth to argue, to protest, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? "Thanks for the sacrifice, see you in the afterlife." Instead, he swallowed hard, his voice thick. "You sure about this, old man?" "Sure as I've ever been about anything, Zephyr. You keep them alive. That's an order." Zephyr nodded, though he knew Fenton couldn't see it. "Understood, Commander." "We'll make it count." The line went dead, and a piece of Zephyr went with it. He turned back to the crew, his resolve hardening like steel dipped in ice water. "All right, people, you heard the man. Fenton's buying us time. Let's not waste it." The air in the bridge was electric, the weight of Fenton's impending sacrifice a heavy shroud, but they moved with a purpose that belied their fear. The rust bucket lurched into action, and for a moment Zephyr allowed himself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could pull this off. Outside, Fenton's freighter peeled away from the chaos, engines flaring as it barreled toward the Xylar flagship. Zephyr watched on the holo display, heart in his throat. The old man was giving them a chance, and it was a hell of a gamble. "Godspeed, you magnificent bastard," Zephyr whispered, knowing Fenton would have laughed at the sentiment. With a final, defiant roar, the freighter collided with the Xylar flagship. The explosion was a blossom of fire and debris, a brief, brilliant star in the void. And just like that, a path opened, a narrow corridor between life and death. "Now's our chance," Zephyr barked. "Punch it before they regroup." Sierra worked her console like a maestro, the rust bucket lunging forward as the engine strained against the void. The crew was a blur of motion, a whirlwind of desperation and dogged determination. But even as they surged toward salvation, the Xylar weren't done yet. "Captain, they are on our tail," Kaltora shouted, her voice rising over the din. Zephyr clenched his fists. Of course it wasn't going to be easy. Why would it be? The universe wasn't done playing its cruel tricks. "Jax, we need more speed. Unless you've got a hyperdrive knitted by angels, this is all she's got," Zephyr grimaced. The ship was straining, every bolt and rivet screaming protest, but they had to make it. They had to. An alert blared, a harsh reminder of their peril. Zephyr glanced at the radar, heart sinking. More Xylar ships, emerging from the shadows, closing in like wolves scenting blood. "Brace for impact," he yelled, gripping his station with knuckles white as bone. The Xylar ships fired, and the rust bucket shuddered under the assault. Systems flickered and died. The bridge plunged into darkness for a heartbeat before emergency lighting flickered to life. They were out of time, out of options. In the chaos, Zephyr found himself questioning everything. Every decision, every order. Had he been right to fight, or had he been a fool, a captain leading his crew to the slaughter? "Zephyr," Leora's voice cut through the maelstrom, sharp and clear. "We need you. Now more than ever." He looked at her, saw the determination in her eyes, the belief, and something inside him steadied. They weren't done. Not yet. "We're almost there," he said, louder now, letting his voice carry over the chaos. "We hold on a little longer, and maybe we'll live to see another day." The rust bucket raced forward, engines screaming, the crew united in their defiance. They were battered, bruised, but not broken. Not yet. And as the battles raged on, as hope seemed a distant memory, Zephyr held onto the one thing that couldn't be taken, his refusal to give up, to bow to the darkness without a fight. They were scattered, pushed to their limits, but they were human. Resilient, stubborn, and just crazy enough to think they might survive. So they fought against the odds, against the end. Because surrender wasn't in their vocabulary and retreat wasn't an option. They were the crew of the rust bucket, misfits and outcasts, but they were still standing. And for the moment, that was enough. As the dust settled and the echoes of battle faded, Zephyr knew they'd face the dawn with scars, but they'd face it together. The rust bucket limped forward, a battered jalopy in a universe of sleek sports cars. Zephyr Ignatius, self-appointed captain, leader, and head of the Rust Bucket support group, was in no mood for a pep talk, but here he was, at the edge of reason, needing one. Funny how desperation made motivational speakers out of cynics. "Kaltora, where are we on the not dying checklist?" Zephyr asked, gripping the edge of the holo table as if it might save him from drowning in the sea of bad news. "Somewhere between screwed and totally screwed, Captain," Kaltora replied, her fingers running across her console with the precision of a surgeon and the enthusiasm of a cat being dragged to the vet. "Good to know we're consistent." The ship's alarms continued their merry wail, a reminder that the Xylar Dominion had not yet tired of trying to turn them into a cautionary tale. The bridge lights flickered once more, casting ghostly shadows over the faces of the crew. They looked like a bunch of extras in a low-budget horror movie, more fitting than Zephyr cared to admit. Jax, the man with the magic touch at the console, was furiously typing away. "Captain, I've got bad news and worse news. Which one you want first?" "Dealer's choice, Jax." "Surprise me. The bad news is we're about to lose main thrusters. The worst news is that the auxiliary thrusters are about as useful as a chocolate teapot." "Perfect. Just what I needed, a reason to develop a drinking problem." Leora, ever the voice of reason, or was it reason's snarky cousin, chimed in. "Zephyr, I've got something. It might be a long shot, but hear me out. At this point, I'd entertain a plan involving tap-dancing tigers if it meant a chance at survival." "There's an old Terran legend," Leora began, her eyes lighting up with a madman's fervor, "about parallel universes meshing with Iors, allowing those brave or stupid enough to tap into them. The Xylar don't know about it because they're too busy being space dictators." Zephyr raised an eyebrow. "So what? We're gonna wish our problems away? Maybe click our heels 3 times and hope we wake up in Kansas?" "No, I'm talking about manipulating those universes. If we can find the right frequency." "Sounds a lot like witchcraft, Leora," Zephyr interrupted, though curiosity gnawed at his skepticism. "Call it what you want, but if we can do it, we might just turn the tables." The rest of the crew exchanged glances, the kind that spoke volumes without uttering a word. It was a look that said, "We're desperate enough to try this and only half expect it to blow up in our faces." Zephyr sighed, a sound that carried the weight of every questionable decision he'd made and the anticipation of several more. "All right, Leora. You think you can make this work? I can sure as hell try. That's the spirit. Jax, you and Leora figure out how to make sense of this parallel mumbo-jumbo. Kaltora, keep us from exploding until then. Sierra, find something sharp and pointy just in case." Sierra grinned, brandishing a wrench that had seen more action than most of the crew. "Aye, Captain." "I've got just the thing." The clock was ticking, time slipping through their fingers like sand through a sieve, or maybe like free drinks at a dingy spaceport bar, gone before you could appreciate the savor. As the bridge descended into a flurry of activity, Zephyr stood back, watching his crew work. They were a motley bunch, bound together by the shared experience of having nowhere else to go and a talent for surviving the impossible. It was a kind of magic, he supposed, how humans could find strength in the unlikeliest places. "So, how does this work, Leora?" Jax asked, squinting at the array of data flooding his screen. "We need to generate a field that can tap into the overlapping frequencies of our universe and the nearest parallel ones," Leora explained, her hands moving as she spoke, painting the air with her vision. "It's like trying to find the one radio station playing something other than static in this cosmic mess. Why do I get the feeling this is going to end in tears or fireworks?" Zephyr muttered, watching the chaos unfold with a mix of skepticism and hope. "Because it probably will," Kaltora replied, not looking up from her console. "But hey, nothing ventured, nothing exploded violently." Zephyr couldn't help but chuckle despite the gravity of their situation. Maybe it was madness, the kind that took root in the minds of those who'd spent too long staring into the abyss. Or maybe it was just that special blend of gallows humor that kept them all from falling apart. The rust bucket shuddered again, a reminder that the Xylar were still out there, eager to finish what they'd started. Zephyr could almost picture them, hovering in their pristine ships, wondering why this ragtag group of humans refused to die quietly. "All right, let's make some magic happen," Leora said, her hands dancing over the controls with the grace of a maestro conducting an orchestra, a very unstable and potentially explosive orchestra. Zephyr watched as the ship systems hummed to life, a low thrum that vibrated through the deck plates like the purr of a very large, very irritable cat. It was a sound that promised either salvation or disaster, depending on how generous the universe was feeling. "Fields generating," Jax announced, eyes glued to his monitor. "We're getting some weird readings, but—" "I think it's working." "Define weird," Zephyr quipped, his curiosity piqued. "Weird as in, we're seeing other versions of ourselves. Just don't ask them for life advice." Zephyr shook his head, a rueful smile on his lips. "Sounds like a party." The ship lurched, systems protesting as the field enveloped them. It was a sensation like no other, as if they were being pulled in 1,000 directions at once, each tug a whisper from an alternate reality. "Hold it steady, folks," Zephyr urged, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We're not done yet." The Xylar ships, once pressing in like a pack of hungry wolves, seemed to hesitate, their movements sluggish and unsure. It was as if the universe itself had taken a step back, allowing the rust bucket a moment's reprieve. "Captain, it's working." Leora's voice was a mix of disbelief and triumph. "They're confused. We've thrown them off." Zephyr felt a surge of hope, that rare and precious thing that had been in such short supply. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance after all. "Then let's not waste it," he said, his voice carrying over the din. "Get us clear of here." The rust bucket surged forward, engines straining but steady, their path opening as the Xylar struggled to comprehend the impossible. It was a small victory, but in a universe that thrived on chaos, small victories were worth celebrating. But Zephyr knew better than to count his chickens before they hatched, or his crew before they were out of the frying pan. The cost of using this newfound power was still unknown, the price they might pay lurking in the shadows. "How long can we hold this?" Zephyr asked, glancing at Leora. "Not long," she admitted, her fingers still flying over the console. "Maybe a few more minutes. It's taking everything we've got." Zephyr nodded, acknowledging the grim reality. They were living on borrowed time, every second a gift snatched from the jaws of fate. As the ship continued its escape, Zephyr allowed himself a moment to breathe, to take in the sight of his crew working together, defying the odds with nothing more than sheer stubbornness and a healthy dose of insanity. "Not bad for a rusty old tub," Sierra quipped, wrench still in hand. "Yeah," Zephyr agreed, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. "Not bad at all." And so they pressed on, a motley band of misfits carving their path through the stars, guided by the faintest glimmer of hope and the knowledge that, whatever came next, they'd face it together. It was a gamble, a leap of faith into the unknown, but what was life without a little risk? They were human, after all, brave, foolish, and just crazy enough to believe they could change the universe, one parallel at a time. And as they raced toward salvation, the crew of the Rust Bucket knew one thing for certain: they'd fight until the end, because giving up simply wasn't in their nature. The Rust Bucket trembled like a geriatric dog left out in a rainstorm. Zephyr Ignatius, captain of this metal coffin, held onto the armrest of his seat as if it might get up and walk away. The Xylar Dominion was still out there, eager to add the Rust Bucket and her crew to their collection of cosmic roadkill, but Zephyr had other plans. "We're running on borrowed time," Leora said with a dry chuckle, fingers prancing over the console like a tap-dancing spider. "This parallel universe mumbo-jumbo is like trying to keep a soufflé from collapsing with a leaf blower." "Thanks for the culinary analogy," Zephyr replied, sarcasm etched into every word. "Now I'm hungry for something that doesn't taste like despair." "Oh, I've got a stale protein bar if you're feeling adventurous," Sierra offered, waving the dubious snack in the air. It was the kind of bar that could double as a bludgeoning weapon in a pinch. "No thanks. I like my teeth where they are," Zephyr said, eyes glued to the main display. The Xylar ships were still muddling around in confusion, their once intimidating formation now resembling a drunken Kangal line. Kaltora piped up, "Captain, if we're gonna make this work, we need to crank this field up to 11. Otherwise, the Xylar are gonna snap out of their stupor faster than a scorned lover at a wedding." "Right. And how exactly do we do that without turning us into interdimensional confetti?" Zephyr asked, skepticism thick in his voice. Leora shot him a sharp look, the kind that suggested she'd thought of a plan that might just work if the universe was feeling particularly charitable. "We need to harness the energy from the main thrusters before they finally give up the ghost. Redirect it into the field generator. Think of it as siphoning gas from a dying car to fuel a flaming getaway." "Yeah, but with our luck, the car's also on fire," Jax chimed in, his fingers flying over his own console, tweaking and tuning the systems like a pianist at a particularly unruly recital. "So we're gonna gamble our lives on a flaming getaway plan," Zephyr muttered. "Sounds about right." The rest of the crew exchanged glances, the kind that said, "We might not survive this, but at least it'll be interesting." "All right, Leora," Zephyr said, determination stealing his voice. "Let's siphon that gas and give the universe a show it won't forget." Leora nodded, her hands dancing over the controls with precision, redirecting the remaining thrust power. The ship groaned in protest, metal straining under the pressure. It was a symphony of mechanical agony, underscored by the alarm's incessant wail. "Field stable," Jax reported, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. "For now. But it's like balancing on a knife's edge." Zephyr leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he surveyed the tactical display. "Time for a little misdirection," he said, a sly smile creeping across his face. "Let's make these Xylar bastards question their career choices." Sierra, wrench still in hand, grinned with a feral delight. "About time we gave him the all razzle-dazzle." "I'll take razzle-dazzle over obliteration any day," Kaltora quipped, setting course toward a particularly dense asteroid field, one of those cosmic death traps that seemed tailor-made for desperate maneuvers. The rust bucket surged forward, engines roaring as they cut through space like a knife through butter, or more accurately, a rusty butter knife through a particularly stubborn block of cheap margarine. "Captain, here they come," Kaltora announced, fingers dancing over her console. The Xylar ships were shaking off their confusion, cobbling together some semblance of a pursuit. "Then let's give him a run for their money," Zephyr replied, eyes fixed on the screen. The asteroid field loomed ahead, spinning rocks and debris creating a deadly obstacle course. But it was also their best shot at losing their pursuers. The rust bucket plunged into the asteroid field, weaving between rocks with a grace that belied her battered appearance. The Xylar ships followed, but their formation quickly fractured as they struggled to navigate the treacherous terrain. "Keep it tight," Zephyr ordered, watching as his crew worked in concert, every adjustment and course correction a testament to their skill, or perhaps just their desire to avoid a messy death. The field around them hummed with energy, threads of potential stretching out into the void like a spider's web. It was a delicate, tenuous connection, one that could unravel at any moment, but for now it held. "Captain," Leora said, urgency lacing her voice, "we can't keep this up much longer, we need to make our move." Zephyr nodded, understanding the stakes. They'd bought themselves time, but time was a luxury they couldn't afford to squander. "Right. Kaltora, Jax, find us a way out. We need to break free of this field and hit the hyperdrive the moment we're clear." Jax grinned, a mad glint in his eye. "Got just the thing. Found us a nice little gap on the far side. We hit the thrusters, ride the wave of this field, and we'll be out here before the Xylar know what hit him." "Doesn't sound crazy at all," Sierra remarked with a sardonic twist of her lips. "Let's do it." The rust bucket twisted through the asteroids, the field around them shimmering like a mirage, bending reality just enough to give them a fighting chance. The Xylar ships lagged behind, their sensors struggling to make sense of the distorted readings. "Hold on, folks," Zephyr called out, his grip tightening as they approached the exit. "This is gonna be rough." The ship shuddered as they broke free, the field dissipating with a crackle of energy. The Xylar ships, caught off guard, hesitated just long enough for the rust bucket to make her escape. "Punch it, Jax," Zephyr shouted, and the hyperdrive engaged with a resonant thrum, propelling them into the relative safety of faster-than-light travel. The crew let out a collective breath, tension easing as they left the Xylar behind. It was a temporary reprieve, but one they'd earned through sheer grit and determination. "Well, that was a hell of a thing," Sierra remarked, tossing the wrench from one hand to the other. "Anyone else feel like we just cheated death?" Zephyr allowed himself a wry smile. "Cheated, swindled, took it out for drinks and left it with the tab. Call it what you want, we made it." But even as relief washed over him, Zephyr knew the cost of their victory was steep. The hyperdrive, once a trusty companion, was now a finicky beast, prone to fits and starts. And the highway, the cosmic lifeline connecting Earth to the galaxy, had been irrevocably altered by their gamble. "Captain," Leora said, breaking the silence, "the highways, it's damaged." "We're cut off," Zephyr nodded, the weight of the revelation sinking in. They'd won the battle, but the war was far from over. They were isolated, alone in a galaxy that would not easily forgive their defiance. "So we're stranded," he said, a bitter edge to his words. "Guess we'll have to make do." "Wouldn't be the first time," Kaltor noted with a shrug. "We're good at scraping by." Zephyr chuckled, a sound full of weary amusement. "True enough. Let's see if we can't turn this mess into something resembling a victory." The crew of the Rust Bucket, battered but unbowed, faced the uncertain future with the same irreverent spirit that had carried them this far. They were human, after all, foolish, stubborn, and just brave enough to believe that they could carve out a place in the stars. "All right, folks," Zephyr said, standing tall despite the odds. "Let's get to work. We've got a lot of ground to cover and a universe to annoy." And with that, the Rust Bucket sailed onward, a beacon of defiance in the unforgiving void, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They'd survived the impossible, defied the odds, and lived to tell the tale. Because that's what humans did. They endured, they adapted, and they fought, even when the universe seemed determined to knock them down. And if they had to go down, they'd go down swinging, shaking their fists at fate with a sardonic smile and a curse on their lips. Because in the end, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the fight itself, the refusal to surrender, and the determination to make every moment count. So they pressed on, fueled by hope and a fierce will to survive, daring the universe to throw its worst their way. Because whatever happened next, they'd face it together, as only a band of misfits could, with humor, grit, and a touch of madness. The afterglow of survival was a mixed bag, like waking up after a drunken night out to discover you're still alive, but your wallet's gone and someone's drawn on your face. The Rust Bucket, true to her name, was limping through space with a hyperdrive that wheezed more than a geriatric lung, but she was moving. If you squinted hard enough, you might even call it a victory. But like most things in life, it was probably more of a grim reminder that the universe had a twisted sense of humor. Captain Zephyr Ignatius leaned back in his chair, squinting at the frayed ends of wires that hung like neglected vines from the ceiling. "Well, we're still breathing," he announced to the bridge, as if stating a miraculous fact of nature. "And the Xylar aren't breathing down our necks," Kaltora added, tapping absently at her console. "I'd call that a win." "A win?" Sierra piped up, peeling the wrapper off a fresh protein bar that looked about as appealing as compressed sawdust. "Sure, if you consider being trapped in the middle of nowhere with no way to phone home a win. We can't even call for pizza." Zephyr snorted, the kind of laugh that was more about keeping the creeping dread at bay than genuine amusement. "Hell, I'd kill for a pizza right now." From across the bridge, Jax raised an eyebrow. "With our luck, that pizza would probably be a Xylar trick, As soon as you bite into it, bam, face full of nanobots. Leora, always the reassuring voice of practicality, chimed in with her usual culinary analogies. More like a molten cheese explosion, but I get your point. We're at least temporarily out of the frying pan, if not quite in the fire. Great, Zephyr replied. So we're simmering, story of my life. They sat in a comfortable silence, the kind that only forms after you've danced with death and managed not to trip over your own feet. The crew, a ragtag bunch of misfits, castaways, and one particularly sarcastic captain, was an odd collection of talents and egos that somehow fit together, like a puzzle made entirely of corner pieces. So, what's the play, Cap? Leora asked, looking over as Zephyr contemplated the black void on the view screen. We can't just drift here forever. As much as I enjoy the company, we might run out of protein bars, and I do not want to eat Jax. Jax gave her a withering look. Trust me, I don't taste as good as I look. Zephyr sighed, rubbing his temples. First things first, we need to patch up this bucket. Start with the hyperdrive. I don't fancy being a sitting duck when the Xylar get their pants on straight. Right, because a functional hyperdrive is the galaxy's best aphrodisiac, Kaltora remarked dryly. I'll get on it. The ship was in shambles, but they'd survived the worst of it. If there was one thing humans excelled at, it was turning absolute messes into slightly organized chaos. And if they couldn't do that, they'd at least blow something up trying. They spent the next few hours scavenging parts, trading jabs, and making what repairs they could. The rust bucket, for all her faults, had one thing going for her. She was stubborn, just like her captain. Well, she won't win any beauty contests, Jax said, wiping grease from his hands. But she should hold together long enough for us to figure out where the hell we are. Zephyr nodded. Let's just hope it's not somewhere they serve human as the main course. They'd managed to cobble the hyperdrive into something resembling functionality, but it was touch and go, like an old car that only starts when you threaten it with a sledgehammer. But it was enough to get them moving again, albeit cautiously. As the ship hummed to life, Zephyr let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The vastness of space stretched out before them, endless and indifferent. A reminder that no matter how clever they thought they were still tiny specks in a universe that barely even noticed they were there. So, any chance we can find a friendly port? Sierra asked, hopeful optimism sneaking into her voice. Zephyr glanced at the navigation screen, which was as blank as his last tax return. Unless you consider a field of asteroids to be friendly, we're kinda limited on options. Could be worse, Kaltora said, shrugging. At least it's not a black hole. Yet, Zephyr added, because if life had taught him anything, it was that tempting fate was an inevitable part of the captain's handbook. The rust bucket drifted through space, making ponderous progress toward an uncertain future. But for all their setbacks, they had two things working in their favor: determination and a general disregard for authority. A combination that had served them well, if only by the skin of their teeth. So what now? Jax asked as they gathered in the ship's cramped galley. We can't just keep running forever. Zephyr pondered the question, leaning back in his chair with a contemplative frown. We regroup, we repair, and we find a way to punch the Xylar right in their smug, dictatorial faces. Because if there's one thing I can't stand, it's being told what to do. The others grinned, a shared sentiment echoing through the ragtag crew. They were outmatched, outgunned, and hanging on by a thread, but they were still here. And as long as they had that, they had a chance. All right, Zephyr continued, raising his mug in a toast, to surviving by the skin of our teeth and proving the universe wrong. Again, Sierra added, clinking her mug with his. May we continue to annoy the hell out of them, Kaltora added, grinning. Leora chuckled, joining the toast. And to making the Xylar regret ever crossing paths with us. Jax nodded, his eyes alight with mischief. To never backing down. They drank, savoring the moment of camaraderie and the knowledge that they'd beaten the odds. For now, at least. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape, one reckless decision at a time. As the rust bucket sailed through the void, the crew knew they were fighting something bigger than themselves. But they also knew that as long as they had each other, there was still hope, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to see them through. Zephyr sat back, a quiet smile playing on his lips as he watched his crew, a family of sorts, forged in the fires of adversity and bound by a shared desire to carve their own path among the stars. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and for now, that was more than enough. "Here's to us," Zephyr said, raising his mug again, "and to making this universe a little less predictable." The crew echoed the sentiment, a ragtag band of misfits united by a common goal: to survive, to rebel, and to keep fighting, no matter the odds. Because if there was one thing humans were good at, it was refusing to go quietly into the night. In the end, the rust bucket may have been a battered, unreliable heap, but she was home. And as long as they had their wits and each other, they'd find a way to persevere. Because that's what humans did. They survived, they adapted, and they fought. Even when the universe seemed determined to knock them down, they got back up, fists raised and ready for whatever came next. The rust bucket continued her journey through the stars, a testament to human tenacity and the indomitable spirit of a crew that refused to back down. They were alone, cut off, but unbroken. And as long as they had each other, there was still hope. And so they pressed on, navigating the uncertain expanse with a mix of trepidation and determination. Ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, with humor, grit, and the kind of stubbornness that only humans could muster. Because in the end, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about living, surviving, and never giving up. And the crew of the rust bucket knew that as long as they held onto that, they'd be ready to face whatever the universe threw their way. Whether that meant outsmarting the Xylar Dominion or finding a decent slice of pizza in a galaxy that seemed determined to deny them both. With a final nod to the emptiness outside, Zephyr turned away from the view screen, a renewed purpose in his eyes. The future was uncertain, but they'd write their own destiny, together as they'd always done. And maybe, just maybe, they'd make the universe a little better in the process.